So this is my neighborhood.
Generations have lived here.
Everyone knows everyone.
It's home to me.
Our landlord does not want us in the building.
New York City is driven by the real estate business.
The rental market's extremely fierce and extremely competitive.
The demand far outstrips supply.
With the property values going up, the sharks come out.
We've seen New York go from a working class city to a playground for the elite.
They want to push out the community.
All of these luxury towers that billionaires are sitting on to grow their wealth.
There's a limited amount of housing, and the system has to get those homes from somewhere.
Above the toilet collapsed. My little brother has asthma. It was because of mold.
These are tactics that landlords use to push tenants out.
Maybe this will make you move.
You don't like the apartment, move out.
They can do some easy renovations and then rent it out for 5 times the amount.
When market rate is $5,000, anything you're going to build is going to be deemed luxury.
This was my building. My home was taken away because of deed fraud.
Everything that I've gone through in life was impacted by growing up housing insecure. The real estate industry is robbing people.
We're talking hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars.
Housing court has become an eviction mill.
This is a business to them. And they don't care if they're taking families' homes away.
People that you push it are the ones that you come up to when you need a babysitter, when you want your laundry. Who do you come to? Us.
Hi, we're coming around with a petition to oppose the luxury towers.
It's unconscionable that the government is paying these developers to destroy our communities.
Not only have these thieves stolen our homes, not only have they stolen our equity, they have stolen our lives.
This city implements rent increases that make it nearly impossible to afford rent. Raise your hand if you want a rent rollback. Make some noise!
Rent rollback!
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm your reporter, Alisha Mess for In the Wake TV. Today, we're talking about Slumlord Millionaire, the powerful new documentary set to premiere on PBS this summer. The film exposes the deep housing injustices happening right now in New York City. Viewers see inside the lives of renters pushed out by corporate giants, as well as homeowners fighting for justice after losing their homes to deed theft. Joining us are the film's directors, Steph Ching and Ellen Martinez, as well as attorneys Adam Grumbach and Bill Lienhard, who represent homeowners impacted by deed theft and help bring these stories to light. So once again, thank you all for being here. And let's start the story with behind the film. So Steph and Ellen, the film captures not just housing injustices, but power and cultural survival. Was there a moment while filming that hit closer to home than you expected? Or something that made you see the story differently?
Do you want to go ahead or?
Sure. I mean, so documentaries take a really long time. So we've been working on this film for, I'd say, like over 5 years. And really something that just sunk in with me is just how much I thought about, the cost of gentrification walking around. You see a new building being built after making this film and seeing these stories of people getting harassed by their landlords and the deed fraud stories. It's really just, I start thinking, like, how did this building get here? Like, did they force people out of these apartments? And is that why there's this vacant lot? So I think that is something that's kind of stuck with me. And I'm curious if it will stick with viewers as well, just walking around.
Yeah, I guess just to add on to that, I think one of the things that was really kind of eye-opening for me was just how interconnected all of the issues surrounding housing are. I had initially started this film kind of following, more of the typical stories that folks are used to hearing with, landlords cutting off the heat and hot water and other sort of harassment tactics that, our friends and neighbors have been experiencing over the years. And as we started digging deeper, we started to see how a lot of these systems are built in a certain way to kind of perpetuate these issues, understanding how much real estate money goes into politics and how that informs the laws that end up happening and being carried out. And also finding things like deed theft, where, we weren't as familiar with this when we first started the film, and hearing about how this was so targeted and so racially targeted was something that was really eye-opening to us. And understanding that, this is something that isn't just happening in New York, it's happening throughout the country. How, how prejudice really does affect what's going on in housing.
Yeah, I must know, have you guys personally experienced housing insecurity in a way that has influenced your direction in this film?
Not personally, no. I mean, I've been very fortunate to, not personally deal with terrible landlords or anything like I've had bad landlords, where, my first apartment was in, a 1-bedroom apartment that was forced into a 3-bedroom apartment, things like that. But personally, I haven't had that experience. But, living in New York, we've heard so many stories from basically anyone you talk to. So that's definitely been a big influence for me.
What I enjoyed, one of the things I enjoyed about this film is the representation of it all. Even if you haven't experienced it or not, you know that this is something that is happening explosively in various communities, throughout the entire city. So I think that's something everyone can, attest to. So my other question for you guys is, throughout the film, there's a striking contrast between extreme wealth and deep poverty. Viewers get to see this a lot with luxury towers as they rise in the middle of historic communities like Chinatown and Two Bridges. For you as producers, what were you hoping audience would feel or understand by seeing these visuals side by side?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that is something just creatively that we wanted to show that contrast in the film. These big glossy skyscrapers right next to like more affordable housing projects, buildings that have been here for hundreds of years. So that was definitely the visuals that we wanted to play with in the film. And I mean, for me, one of my favorite scenes is it's about midway through the film, and it's a conversation with some residents of some public housing developments that are right next to this luxury skyscraper. It's about to be built. It's going to be 100 stories tall, and have one of the organizations that we follow in the film is trying to fight this skyscraper. And it's really just a conversation with the residents that have already been there, saying how this skyscraper is going to affect their community. The construction is going to physically shake their buildings. They had stories about where just then sometimes you can't even close the window anymore because it's permanently damaged the foundation. And also just socially, if you take away this playground or you take away this basketball court to build this high rise, where is everyone going to hang out? Where's everyone going to go? Like, are you going to complain like, oh, all these kids are hanging out here? Yeah, because there's nowhere else to go. So I think that is something that we really wanted to come across in the film, and just how there's a human impact to this. It's not just about money and moving things around. There's actually human impact. And also, like, that's what makes New York great, is that everyone from all different walks of life are able to live here and share culture, share ideas, be in each other's face kind of. And if you make it unaffordable, we're going to lose that.
Mm-hmm. There's a large ripple effect in that, as you mentioned there in the film, when you take away those things that are their livelihood, a communities, their love, what's going to happen to them and what's going to happen to the future generations of their family and their place within New York City. So I would like to switch it over a little bit to Adam and Bill. How does the wealth divide show up in the cases you take on, especially around deed theft and redeveloping neighborhoods?
Bill, you want to go first?
Sure, I'll give it a try. I think that what we see is that the fraudsters and the scammers and the thieves who we go up against are very well funded. They have access to capital. They've got people who know how to work with credit. They've got people who know how to manipulate bankruptcy. They've got people who know how to manipulate the courts. And they don't seem to have any lack of funds to be able to put together very complicated schemes, such as the one that's featured in the film, where Janina Davis's property was taken. On the other side, the homeowners do not have access to that type of funding. They also don't have access to legal services, and they're not being helped effectively by the government. They're not being helped effectively by the Attorney General, and the district attorney's responses so far have not been. We're happy with that they have tackled some deed theft cases, of course, but the response has not matched the money and power on the other side of the problem. So I think that's really where we see that.
Adam?
Yeah, I mean, I would add that I think, the structural forces are that the homes that are being stolen are attractive because they are in neighborhoods where the values are increasing because of gentrification. And it's a little bit of a chicken and egg, because I think the gentrification is happening in part through the real estate transactions, many of which are exploitative, at least, if not outright fraudulent. But I think the piece that feels the most obvious is just the lack of access to legal counsel who you trust. And the people who are victimized in these transactions tend to be thoughtful, smart, often educated people who believe that they are being represented in the transaction by someone they can trust, either because they were referred to the fraudster by someone in their community who is maybe getting a little payout to bring them in, or because they've been told that I'm a lawyer, you can trust me. And there's someone at the transaction who is either a lawyer representing them, but in quotes, or is the fraudster themselves claiming to be a lawyer and being very friendly and making them believe that they're being represented. If you've ever bought a piece of property, and I bought a house 20 years ago, you go to a closing and your lawyer puts in front of you a stack of documents that are usually 500 to 1,000 pages long and pulls them back and says, sign here, sign here, sign here, sign here. If that person is not trustworthy, anybody will fall for that. Doesn't matter how educated you are. I was a lawyer at the time. I didn't read through that stack of documents. Nobody does. You have a lawyer who's supposed to do that. If you don't have a lawyer you trust, you're being served up. And the people in the communities that are victimized tend not to have lawyers they trust. And that's, I think, the sort of the most obvious point of sort of lack of social capital or whatever you want to call it.
Definitely, because there are things many people don't seem to understand, that there are many misconceptions surrounding deed theft and what the person looks like. You know, but we would like to get into that a little bit later on. But I would love to know from both of you guys, how does deed theft transform a community? And, you know, how does it rip it up or you know, remove people from their native lands? Could you just get a little bit more into that for people who may not know?
Sure. Well, I think if you live in New York, you can see it happening all around us. It's happening right before your eyes, particularly in Bed-Stuy, and then also in neighborhoods sort of moving east from Prospect Park on through down into Queens, Southeast Queens, and St. Albans. These are, I want to add to what we were just talking about. This isn't just a matter of a differential in money and power. It's really an issue of structural racism, because most of the communities that are targeted are historically Black neighborhoods and communities of color. So this is definitely a racial problem that is motivated and that is enabled by racism. And so you were asking about, well, how does deed theft change the landscape of a neighborhood? I think that the film does a very good job of showing right at the start, why do we love New York City? Samantha, the young tenant organizer, is just great at explaining why her neighborhood is so wonderful. There's a wonderful street scene, shows all different types of people, she mentions all different types of music. I'm a musician, so I love that about New York too. And what happens when scammers come through, or large scale kind of deed theft syndicates start working on a neighborhood and tearing it up and building and gentrifying, there are a couple of things. First of all, the families that made those neighborhoods great are not getting the wealth that they are due, and that hurts all of us. The other thing that happens is they don't replace those buildings or those houses or put buildings on those lots. They don't do construction and development in a way that promotes the type of New York City that we all know and love, with a thriving street scene and wonderful diverse culture and strong neighborhoods. That's not what they're about. They're about making money, making as much money as possible. So you end up with areas that kind of just look like a group of what I call wealth storage units. I mean, these are just, you know, vanilla boxed, expensive, unaffordable condos, sometimes co-ops, sometimes, you know, rental units, but they just look anonymous. They don't do anything to add to the strength or character of a community. And so it's not just harmful to the victims, it's really harmful to everybody who knows and loves those neighborhoods.
It transforms everything, because it becomes the communities that we all know and love, they become unidentifiable, you know, by the buildings that they bring in, the buildings that they start, you know, to make. It looks different. It just transform the culture and everyone who is there. And we're definitely going to get back into the more of the deed theft topic a little bit later on. But I just want to draw back and say, as you mentioned, like Samantha, she was a very powerful voice throughout the film. And it was seeing a young activist that was very, very exciting to see. But I would love to know, especially with Ellen and Steph, how did you find the people in the film and what made you feel their stories belonged in it?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Samantha too, because our family actually was one of the first families that we came across when we were making the film. You know, like we said before, initially we were sort of looking at more traditional forms of tenant activism and, you know, folks organizing within their buildings. We partnered with an organization called Neighbors Helping Neighbors in Brooklyn, which is part of this larger organization called Fifth Avenue Committee. Through them, that's how we found the Bravo family. And we were just so impressed by them. They'd been in this fight with their landlord for, 15 years at that point. It's, it's the entire children's growing up experience, right? So just seeing kind of how they managed to deal with that, but also expand on their knowledge and share it with their community and rise as leaders in their community was really empowering for us. Another story, Chinatown, is one that, it's personally close to me. My family came here in the 60s, so we've been in New York for a very long time. We've seen all the transformations, and Chinatown, New York, Manhattan Chinatown was the first place that my family, found community, could speak the language, could buy the food that that they're used to and that sort of thing. Seeing how that's transformed, especially in the last couple of years, has really been personally impactful and something that, we really wanted to showcase. So we had been in touch with members of CAV throughout the years and in their organizing work, and seeing also how they are a group of not just young activists, but also elderly folks who and new immigrants, kind of a really diverse group of people, which you don't normally see. You don't normally see, Chinese speaking elders protesting or organizing and doing all of that. So that's something that we really wanted to showcase, is how the strength of a community is how change can happen. And then, I don't know, Ellen, if you want to talk about the other two stories.
Yeah, I mean, the other two, each of these stories could have been their own individual film, but it was really important for us to tie them together so that people could see the connections. Like, it's an interconnected system that perpetuates these crises. If a politician is funded by big real estate, they're probably not going to pass the laws that would perhaps prevent the Bravo family's landlord from harassing them, and rezoning laws that affect Chinatown. So it's all interconnected, and also things that protect against deed fraud. But we found Momita on Twitter. She was doing her campaign when we were doing research. And so we found her and asked if she'd be in the movie. And then Janina, we actually, going into this, had never heard of deed fraud. And we were at a rally with a housing justice organization, and we saw her speak and spoke with her a bit more about it. And we were just so, disturbed to hear about the level of predatory tactics and like the extent of the scam, which Bill and Adam can speak to more later, that is deliberately targeting these homeowners in, historically Black and brown communities. So once we met her, like that also made it so the film isn't just about, tenants versus landlords. Also homeowners are affected by this big crush of just, wanting real estate money. Like they're because there aren't enough units to, rent out, people have now resorted to stealing them from families.
I would definitely like to say here is that as a viewer, one of the things that I enjoyed most was seeing you see a lot of immigrants speak out. These were things that I never seen before. And it shows you that this is an issue. It transcends culture or language barriers, because everyone has to come together and speak out against this in, their native languages and in any sort of way possible. So I know that was something very intimate, but I would love to know, all of you, this is something that you all can answer, but how were you able to gain trust with these communities? Because these are things that are very intimate, very personal, things that people, they wouldn't even want to share, things they wouldn't want people to know outside of their home unit. So how did you develop trust with them? Or Bill and Adam, how do you even, gain trust with the people that you represent and followed?
I think Bill and I have a small roster of clients. We don't take on a lot of clients. We don't do bulk work. We spend, I think, a fair amount of time with our clients. We meet with them usually in their homes, and we walk around their neighborhoods with them. I don't know that there's any genius or trick answer to this beyond simply, I think we've put in a lot of time and let them sort of lead the litigation and let them tell us what they want to happen and try to get that. Bill, you may have.
This is a great question. Lawyers are a huge part of this problem. You can't have deed theft on this scale without lawyers, without the courts, without the police, and without the lack of enthusiasm on the part of law enforcement to deal with it. So there is a very high and legitimate level of anger and mistrust particularly of white lawyers, because we're exactly the type of people who have, in the eyes of the folks we work with, we're exactly the sort of people who have either let this happen and benefited from letting it happen, or who have actually actively participated in robbing them. So we often do start out with a lot of mistrust. And how do we overcome that? We try to do a good job for our clients as lawyers, and we also try to go and meet people where they are, and we try to listen and learn from the folks we work with, many of whom are much more expert in the practicalities of deed theft and real estate fraud than Adam and I are. I want to give a shout out to Janet Bruce, our first client, because without her, I don't think any of us would actually be here today, because it was Janet Bruce who educated me about the problems of deed theft. And because of Janet Bruce was part of the reason why the Senate hearing in 2022 happened, where I think it's featured in the film. And even there, when I first spoke with Mrs. Bruce, and this is a common problem in addressing deed theft, I didn't believe her. I just didn't believe her. And there probably are some pretty strong cultural reasons and prejudices why I initially did not believe this, but certainly one of the things was just ignorance. I was completely ignorant of this issue, ignorant about the issue, and Mrs. Bruce fortunately was persistent and took the time to educate me. So I think that having those conversations and going out and talking to people and just learning to listen is really key in solving this problem.
Just a quick follow-up. What lens does she have to go to make you believe her?
Well, so I think we spoke 3 or 4 times. And I also sat there with her and looked up records on the city records database. And then together we discovered that someone who said he was her lawyer had actually been lying to the court. He wasn't her lawyer. She'd never even met him. And it was at that point. It took a while, I'm sorry to admit, because you should believe your clients. But it was at that point, it was after a couple of weeks of back and forth conversations, when I was looking in the court database with her to see what was going on with this case. And that was when I realized, oh my gosh, this has actually happened to her. Also, it wasn't just my own prejudices. It was also just, I'd never even heard of deed theft. And I couldn't believe that someone could steal someone's house and get away with it. I don't know anyone who this has happened to, because I'm white and I live in Park Slope. And then come to find out, with Mrs. Bruce's help, I met lots of other people, and I realized it wasn't just her. It wasn't just this one very large, fairly up until recently successful group of people. And it was actually a widespread societal problem in Brooklyn and Queens, at least, perhaps nationwide, that is just going unaddressed.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Bill, for sharing that. That requires a lot of growth. I would like to just get your viewpoint, Ellen and Steph. How did you develop trust with the people in your film? Because that requires a lot.
Yeah, I think Adam really touched on this. It really is just time. This is something that we like to talk about a lot, is, we really view the folks in the film as participants in the film, like agents of their own stories, like they're the expert on their own personal experience. So it is about spending the time hearing them, trusting them, because trust is earned, right? So, it's a lot of us checking our privilege throughout the process, being open to learning new things and things that we may not expect to, kind of like not believing your clients, right? Initially, there's certain things that were like, this is unbelievable, and understanding that no, it is happening and these people are experiencing these things. So it is a lot of time spent off camera, you know, a lot of conversations, a lot of phone calls, just, you know, spending time letting folks kind of hash out what they want to hash out. And, you know, even the Bravo family, we didn't film, the first time we filmed with them was in 2022 or 2021. Oh, we had first connected with them in 2020, you know, so there's a lot of time spent just learning about everyone's story and, you know, approaching everything with a, you know, with a little bit of curiosity to be open to hearing that.
Yeah. And I just like to add too, I mean, everyone in the film is a fighter. They were already out there fighting for their rights. So like the Bravo family was already in this legal case for years. They talking to the press. Momita was in the middle of this battle against this billionaire who was trying to attack her campaign. Janina also went to the courts. Cav is out there all the time, you know, protesting and taking action. So this was something that they, you know, wanted to do, participate in the film, help share their story, and hopefully, you know, inspire others to realize, you know, you do have rights, you can do something about this. And yeah, we're really happy that they can all, you know, come to the theatrical run actually this weekend. We're going to have a bunch of screenings over the next week from the 6th to the 12th at DCTV in downtown Manhattan. And if you check our Instagram at Slumlord Millionaire Film, you'll see that we're going to have a lot of panel discussions with all the participants, and people can come and actually meet them this weekend and through into next week if you're interested.
I loved seeing the footage of Samantha, you know, grow up. You wish she continuously came there, you know, to speak about the rent increase, the decrease as well. We get to see footage of her from very small, you know, to growing up and consistently still doing this. So it shows you that young people, they can be activists and they can be very persistent, and they have a large right in the city. They are the future. So one of the last questions I have for you before the break is Momita's story in the film shows how smear campaigns can be weaponized by the real estate industry to silence or discredit organizers. Steph and Ellen, what made you want to highlight that side of the housing fight? Because that's not often discussed in media.
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone is aware at this point that, you know, there's big money interest, real estate interest, potentially in national elections, but we were not aware that it really goes down to even like the smallest elections, big and small, are influenced by big money in politics. And that the fact that her story is just so clear that you can literally see like that Stephen Ross and his billionaire developer PAC invested funds to purchase these flyers, these smear campaign flyers against Momita, who was campaigning for housing justice in Queens. And then you see that these are just copycat ads that they've used against other candidates. So yeah, I think following the money was really important to us to show that this is how elections are sometimes won, because not everyone is going to realize that these are false ads, and that does affect other things in housing. So that we're really happy we were able to include her story.
Yeah, I would also just like to add, this is how certain laws end up happening and how certain tax loopholes end up being, you know, written into law. This is how the system is built this way. I know a lot of folks always say like the system is broken. The system is not broken. It is built in a certain way to benefit certain people and not others. So it's not just about who's winning the elections. It's after they win the election who is actually in power and able to perpetuate a lot of these issues that are happening.
Quickly, how can regular tenants or organizers be able to fight those powers? Because we see Momita, she works very hard, you know, in doing this. But there's, you know, it's that time when money outweighs, you know, one's everyday efforts. So how can one do that, you know, feel encouraged to continue when they know forces are like they're out there like that?
Yeah, I think it is a matter of civic engagement and being engaged within your community in all different levels. One example of this is, you know, you had mentioned Samantha speaking out at these Rent Guidelines Board hearings. The Rent Guidelines Board hearings are happening this month. That's one way that people can actually show up and, you know, fight to encourage the board to not have a rent increase or freeze the rent. I know it all comes down to the mayor. The mayoral election is coming up. Primary's coming up this month as well. So that's another way that folks can get involved. But I know it is a David and Goliath sort of situation. But I think the more folks get involved, the easier that fight can be. Because I think, you know, one of the things that happens is it's not just one person kind of fighting against these larger powers, it is us as a community. So, understand it's not just showing up on election day, it's kind of the whole process up until then. And understanding, educating yourself on who's on the ballot, whose policies are actually going to be benefiting you and are value aligned with, what is helpful for you and your family. I think that's also very important.
Okay.
I'd just like to add to that, there's several very important pieces of legislation being considered right now, and people can call their state legislators to urge them to vote for. I'll just mention two of them. One is the Fair Business Practices Act, and the other one is a piece of legislation sponsored by Senator Jabari Brisport that would grant a 1-year reprieve from the statute of limitations for cases based on deed theft. The Fair Business Practices Act, many people don't know currently, unfair business practices are legal in New York. So just think about that for a second. Deceptive business practices are illegal, but unlike 47 other states, unfair business practices are legal. The Fair Business Practices Act would simply make New York like 47 other states and make both deceptive and unfair business practices illegal. This would be a huge help in the fight against deed theft and real estate fraud. And then just concerning Senator Jabari Brisport's legislation about granting a 1-year reprieve from the statute of limitations, it's modeled on a similar law that allowed victims of childhood sexual abuse to get beyond the statute of limitations just for a limited period. And the reason that it is necessary is that all the fraudsters, they know the statute of limitations like the back of their hands. I mean, they are looking at the calendar and they know how to get people past the point where they're able to do anything about the frauds that have been committed. So those are just two things that people could do. Just call your state legislator and urge them to vote for those two laws.
It's very important that people come out, and support their community and support the rights of their future. So everyone has to be very, very involved in that. For viewers who are joining us for the second half of our show, I'm your reporter, Alisha Mess, speaking with the producers and attorneys from the documentary Slumlord Millionaire. So now that we're in the second half, in the film, deed theft is referred to as an epidemic known largely to affect those in historically Black and Latino neighborhoods in Brooklyn and Queens. Viewers get to see more of what this experience is like through Janina's story. From a legal perspective, what are the biggest structural failures that allow deed theft to continue?
Adam, you want to try to attack that?
Yeah, I mean, I alluded to one of them earlier, which is just that people don't have access to sort of honest lawyers to represent them in real estate transactions because it's an added expense and because they think they don't need them, and the fraudsters rely on that. In terms of things that New York is a recording state, which means that as soon as you have a real estate transaction, it should be recorded with the local Department of Finance. In New York City, that's an online system called ACRIS, which stands for Automated City Register Information System. So if you want to buy a piece of property, the first thing you do is you look it up in ACRIS and you try to figure out the status of that property, who owns it, whether there are any liens on it, any mortgages, any problems with the property. There is no verification mechanism for ACRIS. So I can record a deed on ACRIS. I could record a deed that says I own Bill's house or Stephanie's house. And there would be nobody at the recording department who would actually verify that the deed that I have put in there, which could be completely forged and completely fabricated, is a legitimate document. And some of the deed fraud that happens is in fact exactly that. Someone, particularly with an elderly homeowner who's certainly not checking ACRIS, but who may be not much longer for this world, a deed gets recorded against their property. And suddenly the heirs of that property are in court discovering that there's a document that they didn't know about that shows that somebody else now owns that property, and they have to fight that. And without the surviving person who owned the property there to say, no, I never signed that deed, it becomes very complicated. So one serious structural problem is that there's very little verification of some of the foundations of who owns what in New York City. So I would say that's one large problem. And you see, even in the film, there are documents that are fraudulent, and you have me holding up that check and showing both sides of it. But that's an example of the fraudsters tried to pull a fast one. They tried to say, oh, we paid $400,000 for this property, and here's the check to prove it. sort of hoping that no one would turn the check over and discover what happened. And in many, many, many cases, you'll have inaccurate documents that have only one side of a check, for example. There's ways that these forgeries and frauds take place that are a function of a system that doesn't do a very good job of verifying.
And in the film, we also get to see more of what the deed theft experience is like as, a lot of homeowners come together. I would love to know if, for anyone who may be watching, is there an educational drawback on why deed theft happens?
What do you mean by educational drawback?
Like knowledge that many people may not know about, or how they often get in these circumstances. Because we have someone who is, you see, like Janina's case, she's a Harvard graduate, she's, very intelligent. She had a very large career and all of that, but she still fell victim to that. You also have people who aren't in Janina's case or circumstances, so they may not have had the same, pros that she may have had, but has experienced deed theft as well.
I'm so glad you're answering this question. And I'm also just want to say how grateful I am to Ellen and to Steph for finding Janina and for covering her story so well in the film, because she proves that community education and what the people have called lack of sophistication are not the problem here. So I want to just step back and say, community education as part of an overall enforcement and system-wide effort to address deed theft and real estate fraud, that would be great. But what I see in the advocacy community and coming from government as the message that community education is the only answer, and the problem is that the community is uneducated. I'm just going to say something maybe slightly unpopular and say, I think that is very condescending. I think it assumes that the homeowners are ignorant, and that is absolutely not. It might be the case in a few cases, but my experience has been that is just not true. So I think it's better to come at this problem in order to solve it. It's better to come at it from the position of the homeowners who have been victims, the homeowners affected are not ignorant. They're in fact the most knowledgeable people about this problem. So the first thing is for the ignorant advocates and lawyers and government people and people in law enforcement to go and learn from those folks. That's step number one. And then just as far as so let's say it's fine. Let's have a little bit of community education. I'm not against that. But the main steps that need to be taken to redress this problem systemically are, first of all, the Attorney General has got to step up and engage in enforcement that is equal to the level of this epidemic. Not one or two prosecutions here and there, not a handful here and there, but the type of prosecution that we've seen it from the Attorney General in the past, where you see white-collar criminals being put in prison. That is the level, and it's got to happen not against the small-time operators, not against the line-level people, but against all the folks going right up to the hedge funds that provide the liquidity and the expertise and the lawyers and the bankers and everybody else who makes this problem happen. The other thing that I would say is that on the nonprofit side, unfortunately, the funding for advocacy goes towards tenant advocacy, which is great, but it doesn't address deed theft. And then it also goes towards just kind of keeping people housed. So there is good foreclosure defense funding, but when it comes to fighting for community wealth that's built on the wealth of families that made these neighborhoods great, there's a big gap in nonprofit funding, and that is something that government and private foundations need to address.
I just want to emphasize the law enforcement component, because Bill mentioned the Attorney General.
Yeah.
Also, the district attorneys of Brooklyn and Queens. The Queens district attorney has actually been more proactive and more aggressive in prosecuting deed theft. The Brooklyn district attorney, much less so.
Why is that?
Well, I mean, everybody has their reasons, but I think part of it is just that white collar crime is harder to prosecute. The people you end up across the table from in court have really, really good lawyers, expensive, high-priced lawyers who will pour a lot of money into keeping their clients out of jail. And be that as it may, the district attorney and the prosecutor's offices have white collar divisions. They have people whose job it is to go after this stuff. And it feels as though there's room for growth in the aggressiveness with which they attack these problems.
And also just quickly too, Adam and Bill, I remember when we were speaking with you for the film, something that a lot of people might not know is just the level of deception. I mean, I remember you talked about just fake lawyers, fake checks, forged documents, and also the level of trust that they try to get in. Like the fraudster tries to get in through like a friend from church or someone really close with them. Like, I don't know if you have any other comments about those extreme tactics.
Yeah, well, I think I might have mentioned this in the film, but I interviewed a client who discovered years later that he was in a room at a closing with 6 people there. Kind of, if you've had a closing, you know that like lots of people show up, notaries, people from the banks, lawyers. He discovered subsequently that not a single person was who they said they were, not one. There's no level of community education that's going to grapple with that kind of fraud. That's a sting operation by professionals. You could be as educated as you want to be, but if all the documents you're seeing are faked and they're all working together, your lawyer, your supposed lawyer, works for the other side, there's nothing you can do. So I don't want to sound like I'm saying community education is pointless. I think it's good up to a point, and I think it's good for people to know that deed theft is illegal, and with a lot of work, it can be prosecuted, and you can defend yourself. But it is not going to stop these folks when every single property the median value of a property that they can get in Brooklyn is $1 million. It's too big a problem for just community education alone.
Yeah, because
I think also.
Go ahead. Yes.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to add. I know something else that you had both brought up, both here and also when we were filming, was the idea of what the punishment is for this. Because a lot of times it's a fine, and that's what the cost of doing business. You know, if you have $1 million properties, it doesn't really hurt the perpetrator, right? Even if they are caught. So I'm curious, like what do you think would be a better way to kind of stop these folks, like disincentivizing. Okay, perfect.
That was one of my questions. Well, what would real accountability look like, you know, in courtrooms, in policy, or in communities? Because from deed theft, this is something damaging. As we get to see with Janina, she lost her home, correct me if I'm wrong, in 2005. It was official where her home was gone from her from deed theft. So, and she still seems to be fighting. She said this has been something that has come on like a full-time job for her because something has been stolen from her most prized possession, which is her home. And it's been years now. So how can one, you know, help her in her situation? And what would policies look like to be able to capture the bad guys in the situation?
I mean, the simplest answer is lengthy prison sentences. That people who are engaged in deed theft are destroying lives in a way that the mugger on the street could only dream of, right? Like, you know, you knock somebody in the head and take their cell phone, you are likely going to go to Rikers for a while, and then you're likely going to go to prison. You take 10 houses, each worth $1 million, with 2 or 3 families destroyed in the process. And as Steph just said, you know, you might get probation, and that becomes a cost. You might be told you have to pay back a certain amount of money to that family, but it becomes a cost of doing business. You're stealing, in some cases, hundreds of houses, and you get caught on several. You may get sued on a couple and have to give the title back, but it's really just part of the business model that you work in. I think I said this in the film, but there's a lot of research that shows that the criminals who are most deterred by prison sentences are white-collar criminals. They are the most deliberative. They are the ones who are thinking about the consequences. So if they actually start going to prison, they will stop that particular behavior. And that is, I think, the surest route to cutting down on this type of behavior, rather than sort of saying we need to immunize the entire city of New York City by giving them education about what deed theft is. If we actually go after the bad guys and put them in prison for 10, 15, 20 years, people will stop saying, you know, will start to say, this is not the business I want to go into.
Okay. And now this is my very last question for all of you guys. You've had great insight on everything here. But what do you hope someone watching, especially someone facing housing insecurity or deed theft, what would you say if they walk away from this film? What is something that you want for them to walk away with after watching Slumlord Millionaire?
And I hope that folks feel more empowered to speak out, understand that they're not alone, because I feel like a lot of these experiences are very lonely experiences. It could feel like just you against your landlord in housing court, or you against, the deceptive developer. But these are systemic issues, and there are other folks who are experiencing the same things. One thing that has come out of the deed theft experience is a lot of the homeowners have found each other and have created coalitions where they're comparing notes, understanding their cases, and figuring out ways to maybe reopen cases or find out that they have similarities in who the developers or fraudsters are. So I think a lot is finding support within your community and joining up together in order to kind of fight back.
Mm-hmm. And some of that support could look like, find your neighborhood tenant organization. Like, for example, the Bravos found Neighbors Helping Neighbors, and they help connect them to an attorney, or even just contacting your local city council member. That's what Momita wanted to do. And that's what many city council people do across the city. You have a tenant, you have an issue with your landlord, they can give you advice or they can direct you to the certain organization. So it could just like a little bit of hope of you can just start there and see where it goes.
Bill or Adam?
Well, I would like, if there are folks who are feeling housing insecurity because of real estate fraud or deed theft, I think the first thing I want them to take away from this, from Slumlord Millionaire, is that they're not alone, and that they may be experiencing a lot of embarrassment and shame around the worst business deal of their lives that had a bad impact on them and their families, and they need to understand they're not alone in that, and that there was probably not much they could do to have avoided being targeted by people who were willing to engage in really immoral behavior to try to steal their wealth any which way. And I think if they can overcome the shame and embarrassment, they may be able to do something about it by finding a lawyer on their own. And just on that point, I will say, don't go with someone recommended by the realtor or someone recommended by somebody who was associated with the property or somebody who was associated with in any way with what happened, because you don't know whether they are actually working for the other side. They should reach out to the City Bar Association and try to find somebody who is independent, who's going to be a trustworthy lawyer for them.
Just to echo that a little bit, we went to a Zoom meeting. It was still sort of the tail end of the pandemic. It was probably 2022. It was called in the 79th precinct by a community organizer. And the Attorney General was going to come to the meeting, and they had a Zoom license for 100 viewers on camera, and they filled up instantly with 100 people, and they didn't have room for the remaining. I think there were another 100, 150 people. Everybody on that camera knew someone whose home had been stolen through deed theft. It was a shattering moment to realize just how pervasive and brutal it was. And there were several people who started to tell their stories for the first time. So Bill's point about this is an epidemic, and the response of sort of educating the community, again, it makes sense, but there's a quality of blaming the victim, of sort of saying this happened to you because you weren't properly educated about it. And the reality is that the fraudsters are professionals, and they're targeting certain neighborhoods because of structural reasons. And the people coming together were sort of pushing the Attorney General to really take some action. And she has started to move, not as fast as we'd like, but she has started to move. And there's been a lot more attention given to this issue, including that Senate hearing that really sparked a lot of activism. I come away from that movie just absolutely inspired by all three of the stories, but really, I mean, the Cav story and Samantha's story are really triumphant stories about people who saw something wrong and took some action with surprising degrees of success, actually. And Steph and Ellen can talk about the Cav coda that's not in the original film, but that they actually succeeded in stopping one of the developments. Mm-hmm. And the Bravos are obviously a shout out to success story. And Janina has landed on her feet. She's kind of indomitable and is moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm really grateful for speaking here with all of you guys today. First thing, one of the things that I've taken away from this film is your voice is very important. It is something that will get you, miles ahead in life. And if one person to speak up, you're going to be able to echo that around to millions of other people in your community. And I'm very quite sure that this is going to be able to inspire, people all over So once again, thank you all so much for being here and in sharing your incredible insight. For those watching, don't miss Slumlord Millionaire premiering this summer on PBS. I'm your reporter, Alisha Mess, and this is In the Wake TV. Thanks for watching.
Thank you.
Thank you.